There are things written in stone that were never meant to be read again, carved into the walls of ancient palaces, pressed into clay tablets, etched by hands that never questioned what they recorded because questioning in Assyria could cost you everything. These inscriptions survived empires. They survived fire, conquest, and the long silence of centuries. And now, after thousands of years buried beneath the dust of Mesopotamia, they speak again. What they say is not comfortable. What they describe is not the sanitized version of antiquity you were taught in school. This is the raw, unfiltered record of one of history's most powerful and most terrifying civilizations, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and what it did to the women who fell into its hands. This is not myth, this is not legend. This is documented, recorded, boasted about. Welcome to GrimoryX, where the darkness is not invented, only uncovered. If you've already felt something shift inside you, that cold, quiet unease that comes before a truth too large to ignore, then you already know you belong here. Subscribe to GrimoryX now. This channel exists for those who refuse to look away. For those who understand that history, real history, does not always wear a clean face. Subscribe and step deeper into the archive. And if this weight already presses on you, leave a like. It tells us you felt it. Drop a comment below. Tell us what you already know or what you fear you're about to learn. Share this video with someone brave enough to face it. Now, let us begin. To understand what happened to women captured by Assyrian kings, you must first understand what Assyria was. Not the textbook version, not the civilization reduced to a paragraph between Egypt and Babylon. The real Assyria, the empire that stretched at its height from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt. The civilization that fielded the ancient world's first truly professional military machine, iron weapons, siege engines, psychological warfare deployed with clinical precision. A civilization that didn't merely conquer, it consumed. The Assyrians were not uniquely evil in a world without evil. Every ancient civilization carried its darkness. But what made Assyria different, what made it singular in the ancient record, was how deliberately, how proudly it documented its own brutality. Assyrian kings did not hide what they did. They commissioned it into art. They pressed it into royal annals. They displayed it on palace walls so that every ambassador, every vassal, every trembling dignitary who walked those corridors would understand, without a single spoken word, exactly what resistance looked like on the other side. And women appear in those records, again and again, captured, categorized, redistributed. Sometimes described in terms so matter-of-fact that the horror lives precisely in that flatness, in the administrative calmness of the language used to describe human suffering. We have to go back, far back, to where this machine was built and why. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, the period historians now identify as Assyria's most dominant phase, rose to terrifying prominence around 912 BCE with the reign of Adad-nirari II. But the practices that would define how Assyrian kings treated conquered peoples, and particularly conquered women, were already ancient by then. They had roots in earlier Assyrian periods, in Middle Assyrian Law Codes that are among the most severe legal documents to survive from the ancient world. The Middle Assyrian laws, dating to approximately the 12th century BCE, contain provisions that make modern readers go very, very still. They address women in extraordinary detail, not to protect them, to define their status, to categorize them as extensions of male honor, male property, male consequence. A woman's veil, whether she wore one, who was permitted to wear one, who could be punished for wearing one without permission, consumed multiple legal tablets. Because the veil in Assyrian society was not merely fabric. It was a statement of social standing, of ownership, of belonging. Slave women were legally forbidden from veiling themselves. Prostitutes were forbidden. Women who existed outside the protection of a recognized household were forbidden. To wear the veil without entitlement was a public offense. And the punishment for that offense was brutal. 50 blows, her ears cut off. The wax poured over her head, public humiliation as legal theater. This tells us something profound and deeply disturbing about how Assyrian society constructed womanhood itself. It was not something a woman possessed. It was something granted to her by a man. And when that man, father, husband, brother, master, was killed or captured in war, that granted status dissolved. Instantly, completely, the women of a conquered city did not become free when their city fell. They became available. Let us speak now about what conquest actually looked like in the ancient Assyrian world, because the modern imagination tends to sanitize it into something abstract. A battle, a victory, a change of flags. The reality was methodical, almost procedural in its horror. When an Assyrian army breached a city's walls, and they almost always did breach them eventually, because Assyrian siege warfare was generations ahead of most defensive strategies in the ancient Near East, the sequence of events that followed was not chaos. It was organized, commanded, supervised. The men who had led the resistance were often executed publicly, sometimes in elaborate, ritualized ways designed to be remembered. Assyrian royal annals describe kings personally executing rebel leaders, flaying them alive, impaling them on stakes before the city gates, building towers of severed heads as architectural statements of consequence. These were not acts of passion, they were performances. Carefully staged communications to every watching eye within sight of those walls. But after the executions came the accounting, the inventory, and this is where the records become particularly difficult to read. Scribes accompanied Assyrian armies, always. Because conquest was also a logistical exercise and everything taken needed to be counted. Livestock, grain stores, silver, gold, temple vessels, timber, horses, and people were categorized. Men who could be useful, craftsmen, skilled laborers, specialists, were sometimes deported to Assyrian cities where their skills could be extracted. Ordinary men might be conscripted. The elderly often received no such consideration. Women were listed separately. And the language used in those lists is where the cold dread of this history truly lives. They appear as commodities in the royal ledger, their beauty noted in some cases, their utility assessed. Their destination determined by administrative decision, rather than any consideration of what they had been, wives, mothers, daughters, before the walls came down. The deportation system of the Assyrian Empire is one of the most massive forced migration programs in ancient history, and it is also one of the least emotionally reckoned with. Assyrian kings deported populations not out of random cruelty, though cruelty was present, but out of strategic calculation. Conquered peoples transplanted to the Assyrian heartland could not organize rebellion in their homeland. They could not draw on local networks, local loyalty, local geography. Uprooted and resettled among strangers in a land whose language they did not speak, they became dependent, manageable, absorbed. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of people, some historians push the number past 1 million across the Neo-Assyrian period, were forcibly displaced in this manner. Whole communities erased from their geography and transplanted like crops to wherever the Assyrian administrative apparatus needed them. For the women in these populations, the journey itself was often devastating. The historical record, when read between its administrative lines, hints at what the march meant. Forced movement across hundreds of miles of ancient terrain, without the resources they had once possessed, separated from their dead and their former lives, arriving in cities where they had no status, no family network, no legal protections that had not been explicitly granted them by their new Assyrian masters. Some were absorbed into the households of Assyrian nobles and administrators. The most fortunate, if fortune is even a word that applies here, might find themselves in a household where stability, however oppressive, was at least present. Others were distributed to temples as slave labor. Others still were given to soldiers as part of the spoils of campaign, an institutionalized practice that royal annals record without apology or qualification. Still watching, still carrying this with you. If you haven't subscribed yet, you belong here now. Subscribe to GrimoryX. Those who make it this far are exactly who this archive was built for. There are specific figures in the Assyrian record who crystallize what we are describing, who move this history from the abstract to the particular, from policy to person. Tiglath-Pileser III, who ruled from 745 to 727 BCE, reorganized the Assyrian deportation system into something approaching industrial scale. His campaigns swept through Syria, the Levant, and into the territories mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, a fact that gave his conquests a secondary historical life in religious texts that recorded, from the victim's perspective, what Assyrian arrival meant. The biblical descriptions of Assyrian conquest carry a weight of terror that no royal Assyrian annal bothers to record, because terror was not something Assyrian kings felt the need to apologize for. Sargon II, his successor, continued this expansion with campaigns that produced, by his own recorded account, deportations numbering in the tens of thousands from a single conquest. His annals describe the populations of entire cities, Samaria among others, being carried into Assyria, women among them, children among them. All documented, all counted, and then there is Sennacherib. Sennacherib, who ruled from 705 to 681 BCE, represents perhaps the most psychologically complex figure in the Assyrian record. A king whose annals are simultaneously some of the most artistically sophisticated and most horrifying documents to survive from the ancient world. His campaigns into Judah are recorded both in his own palace inscriptions and in the biblical text, creating one of the ancient world's rare double-documented historical moments. His annals describe, with what can only be called poetic satisfaction, the capture of cities, the driving off of populations. His famous description of Hezekiah of Jerusalem, shut up in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage, was not metaphor. It was psychological warfare compressed into literature, a demonstration of how completely Assyrian power could reach and squeeze and hold. But the records of his campaign in the Levant also describe, in that same flat administrative language we have come to recognize, the taking of women from captured territories, tens of thousands of people displaced. The specifics of what happened to the women in those numbers are not always spelled out, because Assyrian scribes were recording victory, not atrocity, as they understood it. But the structural reality of what deportation meant for women is visible throughout the broader record. We must speak now about the palace itself, about what awaited women who were taken not into labor or common household slavery, but into the orbit of the Assyrian royal court. The Assyrian harem, and the word itself carries centuries of distorted romantic mythology that must be stripped away before we can see the reality, was not the exotic perfumed world of later popular imagination. It was an institution. A managed, administered, bureaucratically controlled institution, and the women within it occupied a range of positions from the queen herself to foreign women who had arrived not by choice but by conquest. The royal women of Assyria, legitimate queens, royal daughters, women of the Assyrian aristocracy, held real administrative authority within the palace structure. They managed estates. They issued orders. They had seals and correspondence and economic power within the world of the inner palace. But beside them, within the same walls, existed women who had come from somewhere else. Women whose arrival at those gates had not been a choice. Women whose names do not appear in the royal annals because the royal annals were not interested in their perspective. Texts from Nineveh, the great Assyrian capital, record palace management in remarkable detail. what was consumed, what was allocated, who received what rations. And among those records are references to foreign women, to women grouped by their geographic origin, to women categorized by their skills or their physical characteristics, distributed across palace functions according to administrative need. Reading these documents with full understanding of the context in which these women arrived, the administrative calm of the language becomes its own form of horror. The bureaucratic normalization of human displacement, written in the same tone one might use to record barley allocations. We should also speak about what the Assyrian kings themselves said, in their own words, in their own records, about women taken in conquest. Because they did speak about it. Not always with explicit graphic detail, but with a clarity about power and possession that leaves very little room for comfortable interpretation. Royal annals frequently describe the taking of the women of defeated kings. The wives and daughters and concubines of conquered rulers appear in Assyrian victory records as elements of the spoils, alongside thrones, golden vessels, and herds of exotic animals. The symbolism was total. To take a king's women was to take his power, his lineage, his future. It was the most complete form of erasure the ancient world had developed. Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, who ruled from 669 to approximately 631 BCE, and who famously built the great library at Nineveh that preserved so much of the ancient world's literature, is a figure who forces us to sit with a profound contradiction. This is the king who preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh, who collected cuneiform tablets with the fervor of an obsessive scholar, who understood in some recognizable way the value of recorded knowledge and cultural preservation, and who also recorded with that same scholar's precision campaigns of extraordinary brutality, whose annals describe the destruction of Elam in terms that make the landscape sound apocalyptic, whose records include the treatment of conquered populations in language that his own scribes clearly understood as declarations of ultimate power. The contradiction of Ashurbanipal, the librarian king who was also an architect of civilizational destruction, is perhaps the most human thing about him, and the most unsettling, because it refuses the comfort of a simple monster. It insists instead on something more difficult, that the capacity for cultural sophistication and the capacity for systematic brutality are not opposites. They have throughout history lived comfortably in the same palace, slept in the same bed. There is one more layer of this history that must be acknowledged before we can step back from it. The layer that lives not in royal annals or administrative records, but in what those records do not say. The women of the Assyrian conquests, the thousands upon thousands who were taken, deported, redistributed, absorbed, left almost no record of their own perspective. This is not because they had no perspective. It is because the systems of record-keeping were controlled by the same civilization that had taken them. Scribes recorded what kings wanted recorded. Palace administrators noted what was economically relevant. Survivors, if they survived, left traces only in the margins, in the rare personal letters that archaeologists have recovered, in the occasional names that persist in unexpected documents, in the biological and genetic record that modern archaeology is only beginning to be able to read. But silence is also a form of evidence. The very absence of their voices in the official record tells us something about what the Assyrian world determined was worth recording and what it determined was not. And that determination, that the interiority of conquered women was administratively irrelevant, is itself a statement about how power operated and about what it costs to be outside the circle of those who get to write history down. We are not the first generation to reckon with this. Across the centuries since Assyrian civilization collapsed, Since Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, burned and buried, and the empire dissolved with a speed that shocked the ancient world, people have been excavating and interpreting and arguing about what the Assyrian record means, what it tells us about power, about civilization, about the human capacity to normalize what should never be normalized simply because it is profitable or militarily efficient or politically useful. The clay tablets and carved palace reliefs that brought all of this back to us were not discovered until the 19th century, when European archaeologists began pulling them from the soil of modern Iraq. The images carved on those palace walls, the processions of captives, the sieges, the kings standing triumphant over defeated enemies, went on display in European museums where they were admired as ancient art, which they are. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, but they are also testimony. And testimony demands that we ask the questions the original audience was never meant to ask. Not how great was this empire, but what did greatness cost and who paid it? History remembers, even when we have tried for thousands of years to let it drift back beneath the sand. The women of Assyria's conquests, the ones who walked those forced marches, who appear as line items in palace records, who are depicted in carved stone processions moving away from burning cities, they are not abstractions. They were particular. They had names we will never know, children they may have carried through impossible journeys, memories of lives that existed before the walls came down. And they deserve to be acknowledged not as footnotes to the story of powerful men, but as the center of a history that is incomplete without them. This is GrimoryX, where darkness is documented so that silence cannot win. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. This archive grows. The uncovered truths multiply, and you will not want to miss what comes next. Subscribe to GrimoryX and join the record. Leave a like if this weight pressed on you, if something in this history refused to let you look away. It matters. Drop a comment below. Tell us what you felt, what you already knew, what surprised you, what unsettled you. The conversation in the comments of this channel is part of the archive too. And share this video, send it into the world, to the people in your life who are brave enough or curious enough or honest enough to face what history actually contains. Some shadows do not fade with time.